I'm Denise, I'm the Scottish one.
And she's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise, the English one.
And she's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Editing Podcast. We've got another guest for you this week, our friend and colleague Sophie Playle, who runs Liminal Pages. Sophie is a fiction editor who specialises in story level critiques. So when we decided to dedicate an episode to types of developmental editing, who better to chat to?
That's right. And Sophie's developmental editing courses come highly recommended by our fellow editors. So we know she knows her stuff. So welcome, Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Hello. And I also just wanted to say a big thank you to Louise, because I think it's safe to say that I wouldn't be the editor I am today without Louise's encouragement, support, all her resources on her blog and everything. She's really helped me at the start of my career. And also, whenever I go to an editing event and you're there, Denise, I always feel so much better about being there. You always make me feel really welcome. And I just want to say as well done on the editing podcast, because I think it's fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you can come on again anytime.
I know, absolutely. We like her, don't we?
And I think we should tell the listeners we didn't even prompt her to say any of those things. That's so kind of you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you both.
So, first of all, can you tell us about developmental editing? For starters, what is it?
Yep. So developmental editing is basically it's like a big picture look at a manuscript. So a developmental editor will help authors identify and solve all those sort of big picture storytelling issues in their manuscripts, things like whether the story itself works, the pacing, the structure, characterization, narrative technique. It doesn't address grammar, spelling, punctuation, sentence structure, all of those sort of nitty-gritty sentence level stuff.
So things like plot, would it cover that as well? I mean, you probably cover that in structure.
Yeah.
So working. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so plot and structure are very similar, and I usually like to differentiate between story and plot, because I think that those terms get a bit used interchangeably when they're not quite the same. So yeah, definitely story and plot.
Can you actually go into that a little bit more, just briefly, because I think a lot of less experienced authors and editors who don't do developmental work might not understand that the nuances between story and plot.
Because I don't do fiction, so I'm curious to know the difference. Definitely.
Yeah, well, I actually think in a lot of writing about developmental editing and storycraft, that they are terms that are used quite interchangeably. But basically, story is what happens, and plot is how that is presented in the book in terms of structure. So you can have a story. Every story will have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the events of the story will link through cause and effect. But you can play with the plot by restructuring the story. So you might have flashbacks, or you could start at the end and then sort of go back towards the beginning, and that's the plot. That is how it reads from page one to the end is how it's been plotted.
Yes, rather than the sort of
the story is the chronological bit. It's the chronological.
The plot's not necessarily linear. Then that's what you're saying.
That's it. Yeah.
The story could be something like a person was murdered and a detective tries to uncover who did it. That's story. But the way that is shown to the reader, like you're saying, through flashbacks or through diary entries or through different characters having separate chapters, all that stuff, the way that's structured and given, that would be plot.
More specifically the time frame.
Okay.
So not necessarily the mode, like the you can have like a letter or diary entry, but it would be the actual timing of the event that creates the plot.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's about the chronology of it then, would you say? Yeah. How that's presented, that it's not necessarily A then B then C or whatever.
Yeah.
That it's okay.
That's it. So basically, in a nutshell, stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. But when you plot a story, the order of the events is considered.
Gotcha.
That's really interesting.
Really interesting. And as someone who specialises in line editing, that's really useful for me to understand that bigger picture, because I think I'm an editor who, because I don't do developmental editing, I think I would be guilty perhaps of using those words interchangeably without really understanding the nuances, and I bet there are a lot of writers, fiction writers, who haven't studied storycraft who might fall on that point as well. So thank you for that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I was just thinking it would also presumably apply to memoir as well, and narrative non-fiction, that sort of thing. It's the same differentiation.
Yeah, and I think most people kind of know what you're talking about within the context of how you're saying it. But yeah, I think there is confusion around it because, and I put it down to this quote from E.M. Forster, who defined plot and story, but I think he actually defined it wrong. So
oh, how lovely for you to be able to say that E.M. Forster got it wrong.
Yeah, sorry, E.M. Forster. But he basically said the king died and then the queen died is a story, but the king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. And he said that plot is all about cause and effect. But I don't think that's right. I think all stories need cause and effect, because if you just had a string of random events, you wouldn't say that was a story.
No.
So I would say stories are defined by chronological cause and effect events, and the plot is when you move those events around.
That makes sense to me, actually. Now that you've,
it's actually an easier framework the way you describe it to get your head around it. I think I'm not sure if I'd have read what Forster had said that I would have necessarily been more enlightened.
And that Forster quote gets used a lot in fiction theory books and things, and courses. So yeah, I think that's, I'm not blaming him, but I think there's definitely confusion around the two terms. But it is useful to kind of think of the differences.
It's a classic thing, though, isn't it, in editing, the editing world, that we see even within our editing community a lot about language and how the terminology is so tangled, and about how people define things in different ways and call different
definitely
types of stuff, different, so what one person calls copy editing, another calls line editing, or another person calls proof editing, and it's very, if it's tough for us to get our heads around it, it's a nightmare for authors trying to make sense of who they need to work with and what they need,
Definitely. Yeah, and it's the same with developmental editing, because you've got developmental editing, you've got manuscript critiquing, manuscript assessment, and then I think there's some people that blend developmental editing with line and stylistic editing, and there's all these blurred boundaries, different ways people do things in different ways. So I think the main thing is you just need to be crystal clear about the service that you're getting, whether that's you're looking at the editor's website or you're asking questions, because there are so many different ways to do things. And like you say, same label can be applied to different services, and it can be really confusing.
And editors, that also, we as editors need to take responsibility for making sure that we define our services clearly, so that
it comes back to that whole thing of, it's very difficult just to provide an off-the-shelf service and say upfront what you do and how much you charge for it, because everybody has their own way of doing things, and it really requires a conversation, doesn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And it's like you say, with editors, it can be hard to know if you're doing things in quotes right, and people kind of get a bit unconfident because they're not sure they're doing things the right way, and they kind of look to the industry and compare and contrast to the way other people are doing it. And I just kind of think, especially with something like developmental editing, which is so varied and can be so different, you just have to think, how do you want to do it? How do you want your service to look? What does this author need? What does this manuscript need? And there's no like template for that. There's no one size fits all.
So you talked about critiques just briefly there, Sophie. Who would commission a critique? And why would they do that rather than ask for a full developmental edit? And where does critiquing come in the editorial process?
Okay.
Lots of questions there. Sorry.
That's okay. So who would commission a critique? So the author usually commissions a critique. So whereas you might have publisher clients for copy editing and things like that, proofreading, it's usually the author themselves who will go to an editor for a critique. That's before they submit to agents, or before they get line and copy editing and proofreading, all those sentence level services if they're going to self-publish. Because it looks at the overall manuscript, the big picture stuff, you want to get that stuff sorted first before you then drill down into the sentences, because you might end up cutting loads of things. There could be some fundamental things to do with the narrative style that you need to address, or the story or the plot itself, and you don't want to get too down into the details before you sort of those big picture things out. So that's when you would commission one, before you get into the sentence level stuff.
Right.
What was the other question?
I think you've nailed it.
Okay.
I wanted to know what kind of person what they would be looking for, and at what stage.
And the difference between...
I suppose the other thing was why they would do that rather than ask for a full developmental edit. But you've gone into that. I mean, it's kind of more. It's like an earlier overview rather than a sort of nitty gritty done for you full developmental edit. And
I think you don't need a critique and a developmental edit necessarily. Depends how much help you think you need. You can have a critique or a developmental edit. Critique is usually more zoomed out, and it's usually presented as an editorial report where the editor will summarize their assessment of your manuscript and give you suggestions on how to improve it. They'll hopefully as well talk about the strengths and tell you where you're going right, because that's always nice to hear. Whereas with a developmental edit, usually you will get the report as well, but you will also get extensive notes in the manuscript itself. So you might, the editor might be picking out specific examples of some of the bigger picture elements. So, for example, a critique might talk generally about how you've used point of view in the manuscript. But a developmental edit might then go into the manuscript, highlight instances of head hopping, or tell you where a scene might be better from a different character's point of view, and they'll sort of drill down a bit deeper into the specifics of the manuscript.
Can I just check something? Would they actually, the developmental editor, if they were doing a full developmental edit, would they be changing the manuscript? That's what I want to say, like actually making revisions.
So I think this is one of the things that depends on the editor. I think mostly they should be making notes so that you can make the changes yourself.
Okay.
But every now and then they might use track changes, or they might highlight a bit and rewrite it to illustrate how you can do something as an example. Okay. So talking about the head hopping example, they might label it, here's some head hopping in this scene. Here's how you might decide to fix it, and then they'll do that. And then for future occurrences of that same problem, they might just highlight it again and just say, here's a bit for you to fix, sort of thing. Gotcha. But as I said earlier, I do think that there is a little bit of overlap sometimes between developmental editing and stylistic and line editing, because I've seen on some editors' websites when they provide an example, have you seen where they have like example PDFs of different levels of editing?
Yeah.
Sometimes I see ones that are labeled developmental editing, and they really get into the nuances of the sentences. So they will be changing almost every sentence, and
so I call that a line edit almost.
So they'll be suggesting different words, different sentence structures, moving paragraphs around, and still like providing comments on character development and all of that bigger stuff. So I think there is potentially some crossover, but again, depends on the editor. And for, like, in my opinion, I'm not sure how useful that is to get too deep into the sentences if you haven't first address the bigger things.
So Sophie, are you saying then really that whether it's critique or a full developmental edit, the editor will be indicating where changes could or should be made, but the onus is then on the author to go away and do that work themselves.
Yes.
Right.
It should never be about the editor rewriting the author's manuscript or telling them exactly how to do things. They should be providing suggestions, because suggestions can help illustrate a point. If you don't, if you're not sure what the editor's saying exactly, a suggestion is a great way to provide that example and get the author's brain thinking of their own solutions.
Yeah. Does that ever cause problems if you're working with a relatively inexperienced author who then you're highlighting issues that need to be changed, but they don't necessarily know how to handle them? What happens then?
You just have to explain the problem as clearly and objectively as you can. As I said, you might offer some suggestions, but if they're a bit too inexperienced, then I would point them in the direction of some more in-depth learning materials, like a particular book or something along those lines, because it's very difficult to write a novel, and there's lots of elements that have to come together and work together, and if you don't know what you don't know sometimes, so
exactly.
if there's too much, if an author is particularly inexperienced and they just didn't realize how much they didn't know, and there's an awful lot of work to be done on the book, then they will probably have to go away, learn about a few different issues. The critique or the developmental edit will give them a basic overview of those issues and a basic lesson in those issues, but it's not really the place for extreme in-depth learning and understanding.
And I suppose maybe that's where it's sort of the difference. Maybe there's a nuance difference there in terms of writing coaching and developmental editing, because a writing coach might be sort of taking a more long-term view to developing the writer's craft, helping
a coach would be focused on helping the writer develop, where a developmental editor is focused on helping the writer develop this manuscript.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. So, Sophie, just thinking back to that conversation we had earlier about the difference between story and plot, which I found fascinating. Have you got any tips for authors on how to think about starting to structure their novel? Is story structure something that they should think about before they start writing, in the planning stage, or does that depend on an individual's approach to it?
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on an individual's approach. Everybody creates differently. Lots of people find it helpful to meticulously plot a novel, or they might just have a few of the major plot points in mind or a concept that they use to launch off from. Other people will just write and see where it takes them, and then spend a lot of their time revising and reshaping something into a more traditional narrative shape. But yeah, I think in its sort of essence, every story must have a beginning, middle, and an end, as we've said. And that idea has been around since ancient Greek times, when it was first put into writing, I think, by Aristotle in the book Poetics. And he literally said every story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the events of that story must be causally related to one another as being either necessary or probable. And I think that's the story in a nutshell.
That sums it up, doesn't it?
That's
good old Aristotle.
Yeah. And I think, from that we've developed this idea of the 3-act structure.
Right.
So the 3 acts are literally the beginning, the middle, and the end. So we have the setup, which is the beginning, the development of the story, which is the middle, and then the climax and the resolution, which is the end. And this kind of story structure has just seems to exist. It's just, we see it through history, we see it through plays, and in Shakespeare's time and beyond that, and we see it in movies and scripts these days, and it's everywhere, and it just seems to be some kind of innate part of the way humans interpret narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that 3-act structure, how about in terms of creativity and flexibility? Is there flexibility when it comes to structuring a story, and how far can people deviate?
Yeah, there's definitely flexibility, otherwise things could get quite boring, I think. But you still need to have some kind of structure. I think the more literary your novel is, the more experimental it can be in structure usually. All stories and genres can deviate from traditional structure, but literary fiction is probably more known for it, because of the nature of literary fiction just being more experimental. But with every novel, every story, there still needs to be some kind of structure, and there needs to be momentum in the story. So one of the things that I think a lot of new writers sometimes fall down on is they don't have a narrative question in place, and that is the story question. So it's the question that is presented at the start of the book and answered by the end of the book, and that in itself drives the story forward. So for example, for the Hunger Games, the narrative question is, will Katniss survive the Hunger Games? And for a book like Watership Down, it would be, will the rabbits find a good home to, a good permanent home to live in, something like that. And that needs to be considered in terms of plotting, because you will then create plot points that keep that story interesting and keep the reader wanting to know more.
Yeah. That's interesting actually, because I was listening last night to, I've got a subscription to the masterclass webinars, and David Mamet was talking on there about Aristotle.
Oh, yeah.
And he was talking about that he didn't frame it in the same way as you, but it was exactly that point about holding that central question through the whole, making sure that through the whole story that you don't lose track of, the author doesn't lose track of that. He was talking about it from the point of view of plays particularly, but that idea that sometimes people go off on a tangent, and the reader just like goes, well, I don't know how that relates to what I'm trying to find out. And he was saying, if got elements in a book that and mean that you're just, and it's your opportunity as an author maybe to preach a particular belief to a set of your readers, but it's still not answering that question, then it shouldn't be in there. He was talking about that centrality of it, to holding on to that nugget all the way through, so that you keep you stop the story sagging.
And that's it. But just going back to what you were saying, Louise, about keeping the story focused on a particular narrative question, I think that's also partly how authors get in a bit of a muddle with subplots, because some people think a subplot can just be a different plot that's just totally disconnected and secondary to the main story, but actually it still needs to affect the main story. Because otherwise you could just put it in a different novel and it'd have like no effect. You need the whole story to feel cohesive. But on top of that, I also think theme is really important in making a story feel cohesive and hang together. So you can have scenes or subplots that don't seem to exactly directly relate to the main plot, but as long as they're exploring the same themes or a different angle of the same themes, then it still feels cohesive and whole.
Okay. So have you got an example of that, Sophie?
So I think just off the top of my head, an example could be in Jane Eyre, when Jane is in the school that she's sent to. She befriends a girl called Helen Burns, and she discovers that Helen Burns chooses spirituality, and she kind of renounces earthly concerns and and kind of submits to the cruelty of the school. And this kind of jars with Jane. She admires how Helen is sort of embodies this goodness, but she just doesn't feel as passive towards injustice. And it's quite this is one of the themes of Jane Eyre, is that she's trying to balance being a good person without submitting to injustices. So we could literally cut out Helen from the story, and we would still follow the story of Jane Eyre growing up and meeting Mr. Rochester and all of that. But Helen represents this part of the theme of good versus justice and all this sort of thing.
Oh, it's like a sort of almost a prop then, in that sense, a sort of an interesting way of bringing in something, a way of giving Jane a way to, or the reader access to the reasons, triggers for the way she thinks.
Yeah, I mean, everything in a novel connects to everything else, and so here theme also connects to plot, and it also connects to character development. So when things interweave like that, you end up with a really strong, meaningful narrative. And yeah, this is that example came to mind because actually one of the assignments for my developmental editing fiction theory course is to get people to look at the themes in a novel and kind of analyze them. So one of my students recently looked at Jane Eyre, so that was why that one came to mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Sophie, thank you so much. I think we could probably talk about this for much, much longer.
Absolutely.
Oh, there's so much to say.
Yeah, there's clearly a huge amount to say on it, but I think this is going to be really useful for fiction authors who perhaps weren't really aware of the differences between the macro levels of editing, such as developmental, stylistic, and the more micro levels of editing that Louise and I tend to deal with towards the copy editing and proofreading stages. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, it's brilliant. So many times less experienced authors, I think they've nailed their structure and their plot, when in fact there's still work to be done there, and it really isn't a good investment to be hiring line editing or copy editing if the book hasn't been taken through that big picture mill. I've learned a huge amount today. Like Denise said, we could just talk about much more of this, and actually it would be useful to get you on in the future again, Sophie, maybe to sort of talk about specific things like narrative style or theme, and we can dig into those a little bit more deeply. But I think this has been a fantastic overview.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it would be great to come back. And I just wanted to add as well that I think it's important to say that you don't necessarily need to pay out for these services, because especially if you're an indie author, you will have a limited budget. So sometimes you just got to think, where do I need the help and where can I put my budget? You might be able to sort these things out with the help of beta readers, or just through like intense personal learning.
Or a writing group, maybe.
Group, there's other ways, because it can be a really expensive part of the process. So I don't want people to think that they have to get a developmental editor.
Well, that's a really great point, and it reinforces what Louise and I have talked about in some of our earlier episodes about when you do have a limited budget for editing, it's deciding where that money is best spent, and it may or may not be the developmental editing stage.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now it's time for Editing Bites. This is our regular feature where we recommend a tool or resource to help you on your writing journey. So Louise, what have you got this week?
So I'm going to recommend something of Sophie's, because I think this is something authors sometimes come unstuck with, which is such a shame after all that hard work of writing their novel. It's an article called How to Write a Synopsis, Everything You Need to Know, and it's brilliant. And there's also a link in it to a book by Nicola Morgan called Write a Great Synopsis, with lots of examples in it. And I'm also going to link to, in the show notes, Sophie's other resource, How to Write a Query Letter. And all three of those things are well worth any author's time if they're seeking literary agent representation. That's 3 bites, isn't it? Not 1. Sorry, I'm bitey today.
We'll let you off because I think they're all very good.
Thanks for recommending those. That's really great.
Well, my recommendation is for Scott Norton's Developmental Editing, a handbook for freelancers, authors and publishers. Now, I see this mentioned a lot on editing forums when people are asking about resources for developmental editing. It's very in-depth and I think possibly a bit heavy-going in parts, but it's definitely a key title that gets referred to a lot. I bought it to learn more about this whole area because I'm not a developmental editor. But I have to confess, I haven't gone much beyond the introduction just yet.
So that's it. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Editing Podcast. You can rate, review and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify or whichever platform you prefer.
And we've put all the links we've mentioned in the show notes so you can grab everything there. Bye!
Bye-bye!